All right. Woo. Good times. All right. How are we doing here? I'm assuming these figures were from last time. Okay. Sorry. Still getting I feel like coming back from reading week, I've been having a hard time getting my head in the game a little bit. So, kind of on the, yes, I will. I also feel a little discombobulated here, so I'll give you a quick recap of where we are at here. Okay. So, these are from like a week ago. Maybe we'll talk about that in a sec. All right. So, today we're going to keep talking about deviance and crime. We were talking about it before the break. I hope you all had a really wonderful, restful reading week. Yeah. So we're going to keep going on deviance and crime. I will try to go back a little bit and just kind of tell you where we were a little, and then hopefully move forward from there. Okay. We're getting back from work, lashing out at your wife and kids, and then sitting down with a beer and the game be deviance or crime. It depends what lashing out at your wife means. If you hit her, that's definitely a crime, or your children. If you just yell at her, then that's definitely just deviance. Okay, isn't the dark figure of crime kind of like a tree falls in the middle of nowhere? Nobody saw it, then it didn't fall. Well, I mean, the crime definitely happened. Maybe you did, solicit a prostitute. It's still a crime. It just doesn't get noted in official records. Is there another chance for us to look at our midterms? Yeah, it's just I'm around like every day, and I have time pretty much every day this week and Monday of next week. I will, hey Google, remind me at 2:30 today to send out an announcement of office hours for SOC 100.
Okay, I'll remind you
Perfect.
2:30 p.m.
I will send out an announcement saying kind of what my availability is like. I'm actually trying to figure out a better way to book appointments than people having to email me, like an automatic system where you just log in and book a time. But I'm yet to kind of make that work. Okay, let's jump in because we got a lot to cover and little time before the next midterm, which is like next Thursday. Okay, so very quickly, kind of taking a couple of steps back from where we were before the break, right? We're talking about deviance and crime, right? And we talked about what is deviance, right? So it's anything that violates social norms and elicits a social reaction of some kind. Chip runner and alternate GM needed for casino. Interesting. That's got to be a school message. So we were talking about, deviance and crime. Crime is any kind of deviance where, there is some kind of official response from the law. We talked about, the differentiation, the deviance and crime vary in terms of our three criteria, right? The severity of the social response, so how serious the repercussions are, how harmful, the perceived harmfulness, both whether it's actually harmful and just how harmful it is perceived, and the degree of public agreement, right? And I had my hair-based pyramid of crimes where, today, dyeing your hair purple, relatively minor, right? Relatively harmless. It's not seen as being particularly serious. So we're in what's called social diversion, right? You're diverting from the social norm. Social deviation, right? Where it's like still not that bad, where having long hair as a male in the 1960s in a high school, right? You would have been seen as odd. You might have gotten comments. You might have been called to the principal's office, but still not seen as that serious. And then our conflict crime, right? Which is something you could be officially punished for, but that not everybody agreed on, and then our consensus crime, where something, whether it's the repercussions are actually serious or not, right? It's treated as a severe crime, and here, right, wearing a samurai hairstyle as a non-samurai in medieval Japan, would have been seen as serious because it undermined the social order, and the penalty would have been death. Okay, and that kind of brings us more or less back to where we were at the end of class, right? We talked about different kinds of crime reporting. Our main one is statistics, right, or uniform crime reports, self-report surveys, and then victim surveys. So both of these are typically done, on social science kind of surveys, trying to figure out that dark figure of crime, right? The crimes that don't get reported, maybe because they're victimless, or just because sometimes crimes don't get reported. Okay, and I guess that leaves us with the following, right? Crime, kind of general rates of crime, peak in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and since then in Canada and the US, they've been in decline until about 2020 when they spiked a little bit again. And crime severity also, generally speaking, has declined since the 1990s. All right, so this is, hopefully that's a good enough summary of where we were. I did that in like 4 minutes, so I feel pretty good about it. All right, so we talked about some potential explanations for the declining crime rates. So the big one that we talked about last time was this, that the bigger, since the 1960s, we've been kind of gradually building up the law enforcement apparatus, both police and things like correctional officers, and essentially, having more cops, better trained cops, more spaces in corrections has allowed police to catch more people committing crimes and to keep them in prison for longer. The second one we talked about last time is, we've seen a decline in the number of young people that are part of the population. So, typically our most active criminal cohort is, men, usually between about like 15 and 25, after which point, criminality declines significantly. Because we have a relatively low birth rate, we have relatively few of these, right? In the from the 1960s forward, we had a really big cohort of young men, as a result of the baby boom. But by the time we hit that kind of drop in the crime rate, they're all kind of then trending into their late 20s and 30s. So that had an effect. Okay, so number 3, so our third explanation, we didn't talk about this one last time. Basically is the idea that, as the economy has improved, as there's been more opportunities for people, fewer people need to turn to crime to support themselves, right? So economic improvements in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s generally led to better economy, less people would turn to crime because they had legitimate economic opportunities. And so we had a drop in the crime rate. That one's pretty disputed, but you can kind of see it, right? The crime rate spikes in 2020 during COVID when all of a sudden a lot of people are out of work because the pandemic shut everything down. So there's some evidence for that. And then the last one, this is sometimes called the Freakonomics argument because it was most prominently kind of articulated in a book called Freakonomics. And basically it says that the decline in the crime rate is largely a result of the legalization of abortion, right? So if we talk about the US, it's a particularly US argument, right? The US, abortion is widely legalized by the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade in 1973. Now the argument here, it's sort of similar to this one, right? That it's young men who are most prone to crime. And I mean, I guess it's kind of a mix of these two. Young men who are particularly prone to crime, particularly young men who are poor. So the argument goes that the legalization of abortion basically means that a lot of the young men who would have been born to poor mothers ultimately were never born, right? Because their mothers got pregnant and then had an abortion, so they were never born, so they could never go on to commit crimes. And therefore, what we see, when we look at our kind of crime rate is, and again, this is Canada. In Canada, we don't get legalization of abortion until about 1986. But basically, about 15 to 20 years on from this, you should see substantial reductions in crime because some of those young people that should have been born, that might have committed crime, were never born because they were aborted. So that's the kind of legalization of abortion argument. It has a couple of significant problems, not the least of which is it really only accounts for things like street crime. Other kinds of crime, especially white-collar crime, don't track by socioeconomic class as much. Rich people actually steal a lot of stuff too. It just looks different. But also the sequencing is often seen as slightly off. Basically, we get to the big decline in crime well before we should have seen the effects of legalized abortion, right? You probably wouldn't see that, like abortions don't really spike in big numbers until way after, Roe v. Wade or the Morgentaler case in Canada. You get a kind of slow increase in abortions, and it's not matched by the decline in crime. The decline in crime is much steeper than the increase in abortions. So there are problems with it, but it is one of the theses. Okay. So who commits crimes? All right, so generally speaking, if we look at crime overall, right, adult crimes, it's about an 80-20 split. Males basically are accused of about 80% of crimes, and females are accused of about 20%. And this is a sort of well understood distributional principle. Like if you look at, say, aggression on a bell curve, women would be like here. Maybe actually, I'll do this in two different colors. What should I do? Like pink and blue? That would probably be appropriate. No. So if we look at like male aggression on a bell curve, right, versus female aggression on a bell curve, and again, this isn't scientific, so just bear with me. You would have a lot more women, and again, this is not a scientific graph, so forgive me. If the blue is men, right, you would have a lot more men here who are considered highly aggressive and a lot fewer women, right? More women would fall into kind of the median range of aggression, like they're moderately aggressive compared to men. Whereas a lot of men are going to fall in, on the kind of, this part is going to be fatter here. You have a lot more really aggressive men than aggressive women. Same with risk tolerance, right? Women tend to be, on the whole, a little bit less risk tolerant than men, and so what you have is a lot of men committing crimes compared to women, right? When you look at youth, right, when you look at youth crimes, the distribution is not altogether all that different. It's about 74 to 26. Younger women are a little bit more risk tolerant and risk taking than their older counterparts, so they commit a little bit more as a share of the total crimes. And yeah, most crime happens in this 15 to 24-year-old demographic, after which, right, so you kind of get, when you're young, you don't tend to commit a lot of crimes, and then as you get to 15, it spikes. It peaks out at about, somewhere between 18 and 22, and then after that, it sort of slowly declines. And by the time you hit like middle age, like 45, most people, even males, are not committing all that many crimes. So it is a phenomenon that tends to be dominated by younger people. Okay, when we talk about the Canadian justice system, the Canadian justice system has often been accused of particular forms of racial bias, particularly for two groups, right? Indigenous people and Black people in Canada. Indigenous people in Canada make up somewhere around 5%, a little bit less than 5% of the total Canadian population, and yet they make up about 25% of the total inmate population. And there's some places where that percentage is a lot higher. In some places in Manitoba, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have the highest percentage of Indigenous people as part of their prison populations. And in some places like in Manitoba, it might be as much as 80% of inmates are Indigenous. So there are big kind of regional variances. By region, the prairies have more Indigenous people than other parts of Canada as a percentage of their population. But even then, they're way overrepresented as part of the criminal justice population. Same thing for Black Canadians, right? Just 3% of the population in Canada is Black, yet they make up about 10% of the prison population. So, yeah, that's disproportionate. Now, this number is largely out of Ontario. Ontario has a really large percentage of its inmate population that's Black for a bunch of reasons, mostly having to do with immigration. Okay, so between 2007 and 2016, our overall prison population in Canada increased by 4.9%, so almost 5%. But the number of Indigenous people in the penal system increased by almost 40. Black people went up 42%. And Caucasians, or white people, decreased by 14.9%, which has led to a lot of accusations of racial bias in terms of things like policing, who gets arrested, and then prosecutions, who gets prosecuted, and things like the length and types of sentences that people received, with a lot of emphasis that basically Black and Indigenous people in Canada get much harsher sentencing than their white counterparts. Okay, so some of the factors that are kind of seen as definitive when it comes to kind of criminological accounts of why certain populations are overrepresented. Poverty. So, on the whole, Indigenous people in Canada, and to a lesser extent, Black people in Canada, are more likely to live in poverty than other racial groups in the country. So white, Asian, Southeast Asian. Indigenous and Black people are more likely to live in poverty. They also tend to commit certain types of crimes, right? They're more likely to commit street crimes, right? So crimes that are committed out in the open. And these would be things like, breaking and entering, assault, battery, theft, both below and above $500 and above $500. Mugging, right, public intoxication, these sorts, drug use, drug dealing, possession charges. These are all things that we tend to call street crimes, right? Why? Because they happen typically out on the street. Now, one thing I will say, because, maybe there's a multiple choice question that's going to try to fool you. Sometimes these definitions are a little bit weird. Like, let's say you're selling drugs. Bad idea, by the way. Don't do that. You're selling drugs, and you're doing it out of your mom's basement, right? That's still a street crime. I know you're doing it in your house, but it's still considered a street crime because it's, like the crimes that happen on the street. Just because you're doing it from your mom's basement, it doesn't mean that it's not a street crime, right? If you're cooking meth in an RV, that's still technically a street crime, regardless of where your RV is parked. So, just, in case a question like that pops up on the midterm, right, that would still be considered even if you're selling drugs from your mom's house, that's still technically a street crime, right? Other types of crime, like we tend to think of street crimes and typically what we call white collar crimes. White collar. These would be, white collar crimes are more things like embezzlement, stealing money from your employer, embezzlement, fraud, computer crimes, right? These are more considered white collar crimes than street crimes because they happen, and they're more typical of people, in a home, domestic, or business setting. So there's that. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I put that out there. Okay, so yeah, our Indigenous and Black people are more likely to commit street crimes than, say, white collar crimes. So they're out there, much more likely to get caught for those things. There's also discrimination by the criminal justice system, which I just talked about, right? Lots of accusations that the Canadian justice system, like the American one, is biased against Black and Indigenous people, more likely to charge them, less likely to give them what are called extrajudicial sentences, right? Where like community service, much more likely to give them actual incarceration, harsher sentencing, more frequent sentencing based on similar crimes. Okay, and then, one of the other reasons it's often given is this is particular to Indigenous communities, right? Weakened social controls due to over community members due to Western culture's disruption of social life in Indigenous communities. Basically, this is your intergenerational trauma, right? That basically Indigenous cultures and Indigenous communities basically were unraveled to some extent by their encounter with European colonialism, damaged quite badly, a lot of their traditions lost through things like residential schools and the 60s scoop, and this has left them less culturally moored, less bound strongly to their communities, which has meant they're more vulnerable to falling into criminality, especially when you combine it with other things like poverty, which a lot of Indigenous communities experience. Okay, I have no question slides at all. Be an actual definition of street crimes. Ooh, I'd have to look up the actual dictionary definition of this, but just think of it this way, right? So if it's a street crime, they're crimes more typically committed on the street, right? They're more typically committed out in community settings rather than white collar crimes, which are more in institutional or business settings, right? So most street crimes are going to happen in communities, right? So things like selling drugs, buying drugs, soliciting or offering prostitution as a service. I'm trying to think. Breaking and entering, breaking into cars, shoplifting or theft under $500 or over $500, right? All of these things would be things that typically happen in communities rather than in a business setting, right? Or an institutional setting where you'd have more white collar crime. Okay, hopefully that helps. Okay, did I go back far enough? Okay, here I am. Apparently I had very long gaps between question slides. Okay, so sociologically, how do our different schools of thought kind of account for deviant and criminal behavior? So let's start with our symbolic interactionists. So how do you become deviant, right? How do you actually learn deviant behavior? Given, we tend to think of everything is socialized, right? Everything that human beings do, they learn how to do in interaction with other people, right? That was the whole point of our unit on socialization. So basically, symbolic interactionists would say you only learn to be deviant and criminal when you interact with others, right? So when you're talking to a symbolic interactionist, they want to figure out, the social circumstances that promote and lead to different forms of deviance. Now, often with the focus that, if you can interrupt this cycle in some way, you could ultimately, reduce deviance and hopefully improve people's lives. So one of the really classic examples from a symbolic interactionist perspective, and I'll tell you another one in a sec, is prisons, right? One of the things that we know is that people who, and this is a pretty robust social science finding, is that if you end up going to prison, two things tend to happen. your chances of reincarceration for having committed other crimes increases, and the severity of the crimes you commit also tends to increase. Now, why? Well, the kind of predominant theory is that prisons act almost like a criminal university in a way, right? You basically go, you're arrested, you're put in prison, and suddenly you're put into contact with a whole bunch of other people who are also in prison for having committed crimes. So you'll do things like interact with them, you'll build relationships with them, which are going to last once you get out, but also you'll tend to trade tips and tricks, right? So they will kind of, okay, well, I got busted for a B&E, right? And they'll be like, oh, well, here's how you make sure you don't get busted in a B&E, right? This is, my trick for how to commit this particular kind of crime, right? And as you interact with people who exhibit deviant and criminal behavior, it will tend to increase your own deviance, right? You'll learn tricks, and as you interact with them, they're going to lead you into other forms of deviance. So that's one of our classic interactionist kind of ways of looking at it. Okay, another one, and I'll tell you about this really quickly, is when we think about something like marijuana use, right? How do people, and again, this is prior to in Canada, the Trudeau era, when marijuana use was legalized and is really no longer seen as a deviant behavior. But before, right, in the before times, the BT, before Trudeau, it was both criminal and deviant. But so Howard Becker in 1963 basically did a study looking at how marijuana users learn how to use the drug and engage in the deviant behavior of smoking marijuana. So basically he said that they typically do it in a couple of ways. And typically people don't smoke marijuana alone. They tend to smoke it with experienced users. Right? So most commonly, your introduction to let's say an illicit substance is not like all of a sudden you just decide I'm going to smoke marijuana. You're around people who are experienced users of the drug. And they sort of, according to Becker, walk you through the process of becoming a drug user. In stage one, what do? Well, you learn to smoke the drug in a way that produces real effects, right? Now, I'm the worst person to talk about this because I've never smoked marijuana and I have no particular desire to, so I can't speak about this from firsthand experience. I'm not a Mormon or anything, I just don't see the appeal. So, from my understanding is a lot of times when people first start to smoke anything, there's a lot of coughing and spluttering, and you don't really know how to smoke it in a way that does anything but make you cough. So, the first time you try it, people have to sort of instruct you on how to smoke marijuana in a way that you're going to get the effects of the drug, right? From there, you learn how to recognize that what you're feeling is the effects of the drug, right? And you connect it with the drug itself, right? So whatever it is, right? Being dopey, laughing a lot, having the munchies, whatever it happens to be with regards to marijuana, right? This is my entire impression of what marijuana users are like, honestly. You learn that from experience, and people will tell you, okay, this is what you're feeling now. This is, okay, you've been smoking marijuana. This is the effects it's going to have. Okay, you're feeling like this, right? That's the effects of the drug, and you learn to figure out that that's what it is. And then you learn to enjoy enjoy perceived sensations, right? So you learn that that is a pleasurable sensation, that it's something nice, it's something that you enjoy and want to do again, presumably. And other people, right, these experienced users, are walking you through those 3 different stages. So something like drug use is a learned behavior, right? It's something that other people teach you how to do. All right. I really have way too, wow, holy. That's a lot of questions. Okay, hang on. Let's clear some of these off. Okay, you'd heard the argument that less leaded gasoline led to less lead in the air, which led to less crime. This is another popular theory, actually, one that I don't think is borne out in the data because, again, the drop in crime the beginning of it precedes the switch to unleaded gasoline and the removal of lead from things like paint and plastics. But yeah, I mean, lead definitely does things like lowers IQ, and lower IQ individuals tend, on the whole, to commit more crimes. I think, from my understanding of the literature, the link between kind of lead in the environment and crime is relatively weak, but I've certainly heard that theory as well. Could the decline in crime rate also be explained by what is considered to be crime/criminal changing over time? So potentially, if all of a sudden a bunch of things that were considered to be criminal are no longer considered criminal. The other one that sometimes people make is that charging behavior, right? So specifically like post-2021, that there was a change in charging behavior, right? So that basically prosecutors and police charge people less with certain crimes. And so it looks like a decline in crime, though actually crimes are still happening. That's been a kind of major argument, say in the US, where a lot of the crime data has been showing a decline in crime, but actually crime doesn't seem to be declining. It's just charging behavior has changed, especially in places like San Francisco. Okay, tested on some of the theorists we discussed before. I'm not going to answer that question now. We'll save that question for later. Do I think the stigma around marijuana changed with the decreasing levels of religious communities? I actually don't know. I'd have to look at the data and see if there's any correlation between decline in religious identity and religious salience and marijuana use. I don't think so. I don't think there's a particularly strong correlation as far as I can kind of think. And I mean, the decline in religious salience really starts around like 1994, 1995. With the millennials. Before that, it's much weaker. So my guess would be no, but I actually don't. That's just an instinct rather than me having a bunch of data in my head. It's possible. Do I think the prairie should increase laws surrounding marijuana for teens? Small towns are full of potheads, which probably doesn't help their schools. I mean, if I can talk about any of my cousins who grew up in small town Alberta, Bonnyville, that place is a shithole. I mean, I hate that place. My mom's from there, all my cousins are from there, and I have a lot of cousins, like 46 cousins on my mom's side. So I would say yes, but also, I mean, I have some cousins who are addicted to meth, so that probably doesn't help either. So possibly, but I mean, even when marijuana was illegal, there were a lot of potheads in small towns, so I don't know that, making it illegal, unless you're gonna have cops really actively patrolling it, is gonna help. Do you think the increased diagnosis of ADHD and anxiety have been influenced by the growing use of marijuana in social culture? I have no idea. That is an incredibly interesting question, but one for which I have not seen any data linking marijuana use to ADHD and anxiety. So I don't know, probably, but I have no idea. Is smoking marijuana a sin in Christianity? Maybe? Like, we think. Getting drunk is a sin in most forms of Christianity. Like drinking to excess is definitely in Catholicism. So I'm going to go with probably. I suppose it depends who you talk to. Definitely not if you hang out around the residents at King's University College or King's University of Edmonton. There's lots of pot smoking there, but I'm going to go with probably. All right, let's go back. These fun questions. Where was I? I am not getting through this unit as quickly as I wanted to. We'll be fine. Okay. So, basically what I said on the last slide, right? Learning deviant and criminal roles requires social context where experienced deviants and criminals teach tricks of the trade to novices. And the more exposed you are to deviants and criminals, the more chance you'll value that and become deviant or criminal yourself. And this is like, when I teach I haven't taught it in a few years, but in the past when I taught youth crime and society, so it's 321. It's a really interesting course. One of the things that's pretty clear in all of the theories about how young people transition into crime is that they have bad attachment with parents, right? Poor parenting, poor attachment with teachers and schools, and little attachment to other social institutions. And they make friends with what we call antisocial peers, right? People who are already deviant, and those people teach them the tricks of the trade, and that deviance just kind of snowballs. The more time they spend with those folks, the more it snowballs. Okay. Another kind of symbolic interactionist perspective on crime is called labeling theory. So, labeling theory, again, is a way of trying to understand how we come to think of ourselves or think of other people as deviant or criminal. And again, this comes out of the kind of sociological perspective that no action or person is deviant in and of themselves, right? That everything only becomes deviant in a social context. So basically, deviance, right? When we see deviance, it's not so much a result of the actions of the people who are deviant, but basically it's the response from others who label that behavior as a form of deviance. Again, this is why you would see, in some cultures, certain behaviors would be perfectly acceptable, and in other cultures, they would be labeled as deviant. Because in the social that action might not be deviant in and of itself, but in the particular social context that you are in, it might become deviant basically as a result of how people label it and are reacting to it. So it's all about the labels and what people label as deviant and what people label as a norm, right? So if if the society around you labels something as deviant, it will become deviant. And there's one weird question, right, on the midterm practice. I don't know if you saw it, but there's the one question about, incest in ancient Egypt, right? Where it was like, okay, in ancient Egypt, nobles and rulers actually preferred to marry siblings or cousins because they thought it was better, and it was frowned upon to not, to marry someone that wasn't related to you. Basically, but today we would label that a form of incest or consanguineous marriage, which we see as bad, right? But that's just a label that we've applied to it, right? It's not something that in and of itself has some kind of like universal biological norm attached. So terms like deviant and criminal aren't, according to symbolic interactionists, aren't automatically applied when someone engages in a rule-breaking behavior. It's only when someone sees it and labels it as deviant. And therefore, those things can also change. Okay, so that's our symbolic interactionist. And again, I'll just say about our symbolic interactionists, right? Just remember that they see everything as just in social context, everything is socially constructed, and basically everything is about navigating how we use language to shape our reality. So labeling theory is all about how people, use words like deviant, criminal, right, wrong, good, bad to label certain actions as such. Okay, so functionalists. Functionalists are somewhat different. And again, if we remember our functionalists, right? So this is my buddy Emil Durkheim, right? This is my favorite drawing of Emil Durkheim, right? Because he puts the fun in functionalism right there. So our functionalists, right, always think of functionalists as they're looking for a kind of homeostasis in society, right? They want things to be balanced. They want society to remain in a good balance where institutions and people are kind of happy and functioning well. And therefore, right, sometimes things get into a sort of dysfunction, institutions stop working, and you get social dysfunction, right? So that's where deviance is going to come from. So symbolic interactionists generally, as I've said in the last few slides, focus on learning and labeling as the way that people become deviant and how we define deviance. Functionalists tend to look at the social dysfunction what went wrong in some kind of social institution or some part of that person's life that led them to deviant or criminal behavior. Okay, my buddy Emil, who put the fun in functionalism, he made a controversial claim in his work that basically deviance and crime are actually beneficial to society, that we actually need them because deviance and crime, they serve a purpose. Now, what is that purpose? So basically, for Durkheim, when people commit a crime or are deviant in some way, what does it do? It essentially kind of allows everybody else to react to it. And in that reaction, right, so it gives people the chance to condemn or punish, and it sort of tells you where the social boundaries are, right? So the way a functionalist would look at something, right, like let's say that there's a murder, right, a prominent murder, someone kills someone else, and the trial, is put on in the news, and it's really prominent, and there's a ton of media attention around it. What a functionalist would say is that helps us all to remember things like murder is bad, right? That basically that deviance, or that criminal deviance in this case, reminds people what the boundary is, right? But even at a lower level of deviance, right? When, little Timmy, is in the classroom and he pulls someone else's hair or punches someone and gets sent to the principal's office. What Durkheim would say is that deviance, right, the punishment from the administration, helps to reestablish that boundary, right? So that all the kids in the class are reminded, that the rule is no hitting, right? So that in a sense, we need those kinds of occasional transgressions of our social norms that are then punished, that we all see as being punished, so that it reminds us where those boundaries are, right? We know where those moral boundaries are, and it allows us to live within those boundaries. Because, norms only sort of exist in the extent that deviance from them is punished, and there's some kind of reaction to them. If we had norms, but there were no consequences, right? Well, suddenly no one would know where the boundaries are, right? No one would know how far you could actually go. It's in hitting that boundary and then either yourself being punished or watching someone else being punished, that is reinforced, right? And for Durkheim, this can result in positive social change because the more that boundary is reinforced, the more people live within it, and the society functions better because everybody lives within those shared norms and values, and they know where the edges are. Okay. So, still just that question? Perfect. Okay. One of the big functionalist theories. So, within functionalism, right, there's some sub-theories. And when we talk about deviance and crime, the big sub-theory in functionalism is what we would call strain theory. Sorry, I'm just checking how many slides I have left. I'm doing okay. Okay, strain theory. So, strain theory is generally, can you see that? Oh, I should redesign this slide because it's a little hard to see. Hang on. I will do that in real time. I'm going to redesign this slide incredibly quickly, unless my computer freezes, because I don't like how it looks. Oh, this is going to be much better. Okay. Relaunch. Check the live stream. Everything looks good. Okay. Oops. And now you can't see it, but I'll fix that. Ah, that's so much better. It's way clearer. Okay. But I can't write in red anymore. So, strain theory, right, is this functionalist theory. And basically, it suggests why people turn to deviance is because they experience some kind of strain in their lives, right? And what is strain? Well, what happens when a culture teaches people the value of, according to strain theory, material success, and society fails to provide enough legitimate opportunities to actually achieve it. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, think of something like the American dream, right? This idea that, if you work hard, you apply yourself, you keep your nose clean, you don't commit crimes, that you can get ahead in the world, right? So, you go to school and all of that stuff. You can get, kind of the material success, a house and a picket fence and, 2.5 kids, or 1.7 kids and 4.5 dogs, or whatever it happens to be. Now, what people who subscribe to strain theory would say is we live in a culture that wildly overpromises and underdelivers, right? That a lot of people are going to fail economically and socially despite the promises that are made in society. And when that happens, they experience a sort of disjunct, right? A form of strain that says, okay, I feel like I've done the right things, but I'm not getting the result that my society seems to promise. And so they turn to deviance and crime because they don't have opportunities to achieve what they want in their lives through legitimate means, right? So, this theory will explain things like, why there's higher crime during an economic recession, right? People who have maybe done all of the right things suddenly are deprived of legitimate opportunities to earn a living, to support themselves, to get ahead financially, to meet their material needs or advance materially. And so they may turn to crime in order to achieve those things. Okay. So, this is going to take a minute. I'm going to tell you this because I love giving hints. There is 100% going to be questions about this chart on the midterm. So I know that's anxiety inducing for you, but I would strongly suggest, oops, hang on. I went the wrong direction. Hiss, snarl. I went the wrong direction. Okay, I need a different colored pen that isn't going to blend into any of these. I'm going to go with bright yellow. Okay, so each of these basically represents, in terms of strain theory, or Merton's strain theory of deviance, different sorts of places that someone can end up, right? And in some cases, these are going to end up in crime, and in other cases, not so much. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain these as simply as possible, and then I fully expect a whole bunch of questions. So basically, Merton set this up on, a kind of, with two axes. Here you have your cultural goals, and here you have your institutional means. So cultural goals is what the culture tells you you should value and what you can expect to get. So if we think of a society like, say, Canada or the US, what are some of the things that you could expect to get, right, if you follow the rules? You could get, let's say wealth, happiness, a Mexican vacation now and then. Not the whole country of Mexico. I just didn't want to write Mexican vacation, right? Material things, maybe kids, marriage, all of those things that we tend to be told are social goods, right? That if you keep, I guess like a job, right? Maybe fulfillment. Anyway, we could go on and on. Lots of cultural goals. Things that you're sort of told are things that you should expect to want in life, okay? And then you've got your institutional means. So how does society tell you to get those things, right? So, you're all here. So one of those ways would definitely be education, right? Education, follow rules. Don't do drugs. Don't, be honest, whatever it happens to be, get a job. Okay. So these are all essentially things that you would be told, this is the method, right? If you wanted, what's the culture's method for getting the things over here that you want, right? These are your institutionalized means. It tells you how to do things, right? So you want to, if you want to be really rich, you go and you get a medical degree, right? You go to med school and you become a doctor, and a surgeon or an engineer, right? And then you design rocket ships that can land and take over Twitter. And thank you for laughing at that terrible joke. And the US government. You take over Twitter and the US government. There we go. Okay, so these are our kind of two axes, right? Our cultural goals and our institutionalized means. And basically what Merton says is there's sort of 5 spaces that you can end up in terms of this kind of grid. So the first one is conformity, right? So what does conformity mean? Well, basically, first of all, you follow the institutionalized means, right? So you do all of these things, right? You follow the path, right? You're all here in university because presumably you want some combination of these things. So that you're already following the institutionalized means. And then if you actually want those things, right? And you go and you're like, yeah, I want all of that stuff. And you go through it, right? You do your undergrad and then you go to med school and you become a surgeon, right? And then you buy a really, really expensive car and house and all of that stuff. You take your annual vacation to Mexico. You followed the institutionalized means towards the cultural goal. So you would be in conformity, right? You're doing both. You want the things that society tells you should want, and you basically did all of the things that society told you should to get there. Okay, so I don't know, which way should I go here? Let's go to ritualism next. So ritualism. In ritualism, right, basically you would do all of these things, right? Let's say, you're supposed to do things, so you go to school, you get a job, or maybe you don't do all of them. Let's say you go to school, you get a job, but you really never kind of move towards these cultural goals. So let's say that you're still 35 and living in your parents' basement, playing Fortnite, getting schooled at Fortnite by 12-year-old children, which is not at all my experience of playing Fortnite. How did they build that structure? I'm going to put up a single wall. I'm dead. Okay, that's my experience of Fortnite. Right, so, but I obviously am not a ritualist. I'm probably here. So you sort of don't end up with things like kids, marriage, wealth, happiness. You're living in your parents' basement. You maybe have, let's say, a dead-end job, but you're still going through the motions, right? You still do all of the things like show up to your job every day, earn money, but you're just going through the motions. You're not really moving forward, into that really high echelon, right? I had a friend who I say would have, I shouldn't be mean to my friend. I haven't talked to him in like 10 years, but he went to university, he got himself an undergraduate degree in education, and then ended up working as a gas station attendant in Lloydminster, right, for years, right? And all he did was just go through the motions, right? Never sort of, moved forward, still lived with his mom. His mom was like 85 and he was still living with his mom, as he's rounding into his 40s, and he's just going through the motions, right? That's ritualism, right? You follow the sort of social rituals of a lot of these, right? You do all of the steps, but you don't get to the cultural goals, right? Never married, all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to fast forward to a question slide very quickly. No one has any questions about this. Perfect. We'll come back to it then. Okay. I'm running out of space to write, so I'm actually going to erase a little bit here. Or maybe I'll take innovation, and then we'll erase for the last two. Okay, so innovation. So this would be where you reject, you want the cultural goals, right? You want the cultural goals, but you reject the institutionalized means. So a really simple example of this would be, I shouldn't use pop culture examples, especially ones that are getting a little bit old, but like Walter White in Breaking Bad, right? Walter White wants to be rich and he wants to be powerful, right? He wants to be prominent, right? He is the one who knocks. He's not in danger, he is the danger, right? He has that ambition for, particularly in the case of Walter White. By the way, if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, it's a good show. He wants to, he's a school chemistry teacher. He finds out he has cancer, and then he starts cooking meth, right? So the normal institutionalized means for getting wealthy would be to go and get a really great career and get a really great job and make a ton of money at your job. But Walter White starts cooking meth, right? So he actually, in this case, rejects the institutionalized means and he goes to an alternate, right? He goes to crime, which is not an institutionalized means, or cooking meth, right? But he still wants the cultural goals, right? He wants money, he wants power, he wants to be able to support his kids and all of that stuff, but he's just rejected the institutionalized means. And you can think of any real world criminal in the same sort of space, right? They've rejected the institutional means, and they've gone to something else, which Merton calls innovation. The other category you can think of here would be maybe someone like Bill Gates, right? Which in some ways he is, and in some ways he isn't an example of this. But I'll tell you the way that he isn't. So Bill Gates, very famously, drops out of Harvard University, right? He never completes his undergraduate degree at Harvard. He instead leaves and just goes and founds his own company, right? So he doesn't follow the steps you're supposed to take, right? You're supposed to take these very particular steps, right? You get your undergraduate degree, you go work for a big firm, and maybe then you break out on your own. And he just skips that step and he goes straight to, create your own company, and it ends up being a very successful company. And you can think of a lot of, really like innovators or entrepreneurs, excuse me, in a lot of senses, as being, to some extent, they reject some of the institutionalized means, but they're still chasing these cultural goals. Now, criminals, especially people like in the mafia and in gangs, I think are better examples of innovation, but someone like Bill Gates could fit that mold as well. Okay, and retreatism, right? So retreatism, I'm just going to give myself a little more space here. What am I doing for time? Oh, I'm doing pretty well, actually. All right, so retreatism. Basically here, you reject the institutional means and you would reject the cultural goals as well, right? So this looks like someone who's kind of completely checked out of society in a lot of ways, right? They wouldn't be doing, and you have increasingly a kind of cohort of men. And I can't remember what they're called now. But basically they've retreated from all aspects of civic life, right? They don't work, they're not being trained, they're not employed or really being functional in any way. A lot of them live perpetually online, play a lot of video games, but they don't have jobs, right? And they would basically be in a sort of cultural retreat, right? They're not following the institutional goals, right? How you actually go, the institutional means, how you would go about getting things. I think of our incels in a lot of ways would be in the retreatist kind of camp, right? They're not following those appropriate kind of cultural means of getting things, but they also kind of reject the cultural goals, right? They might not work because they don't believe that they can ever get these things. Okay, so our last one, rebellion. New means, new goal. A lot of times this looks like madness. And my example of this is the Joker. In The Dark Knight. They don't care, they establish completely new ways of doing things, right? Completely new means and completely new goals, right? And a lot of times, if you're in this space, you're literally off the grid. People would look at you and look at you like you're kind of crazy. So people with mental illness, right, especially schizophrenia, unhoused people that don't want to be housed, a lot of times would kind of fit within this space of rebellion. They're completely outside the goal. But you can think of anarchist communists as this as well, right? People that would say reject, the way society is constructed, capitalism completely, and want to live in a sort of anarcho-communist way, right? In small encampments that are self-governing and where you grow your own food and use gold as currency, right? That would be kind of rebellion as well. Okay. Yes, retreatists living off the grid. I would say living off the grid, you're more in rebellion, right? I think you're more in rebellion when you're talking about living off the grid. Oh yeah, those guys are called NEETs. Not engaged in employment or training, right? NEETs, you're right. Thank you. You can come talk to me. I can't answer this now. I'm too behind. Okay. Okay, perfect. It's hard to know what a topical reference is now because everybody's watching things at different times. Okay, hang on. Okay, I'm done that. How am I doing for time? Still good. Still 16 minutes. Okay, so another kind of functionalist way of looking at this, we talk about subcultures. What are subcultures? Basically, subcultures, when we talk about them, right, are groups that have a set of distinct values, norms, and practices within the larger culture. And a lot of times what we actually see, from a functionalist perspective, is what looks like deviance to everyone else often has its own kind of logic within subcultures, right? So while deviance might depart, in many ways from the mainstream culture, they're often strict conformists when it comes to the norms of their own subcultures. And one of the examples here are gangs, right? Gangs and groups like the mafia are very strong, deviant subcultures, but they have rules, right? They have rules about who's allowed in, what happens when you leave, what you're allowed to do, what deviant behavior is, right? Like things like, what happens to snitches or confidential informants, right? There's rules within kind of deviant and criminal subcultures as to all of these things. And I remember, so one of our criminologists in the department, his name's Kevin Haggerty, he's a great professor. He's been around the block, and he was telling me that when he worked, when he was young doing his undergrad, he worked with a guy who had been in the Hells Angels. Right, this motorcycle gang, and you would get Hells Angels tattoos, but then he wanted to leave the gang, and they actually cut it off of him, right? So they had removed the tattoo by peeling it off of his skin. And so he had the guy had a big scar on his arm where his tattoo had been, and the Hells Angels actually cut it off because you can't wear something like gang identification if you're not in the gang anymore, right? So you would lose things like your full patch jacket, right? You don't get to keep the jacket with the Hells Angels logo on it and that kind of stuff. I have a really lame clip here from the show Riverdale, which I will play brief. Actually, you know what? To hell with it. That show's bad. So I'm going to skip it. It seemed much more topical 3 years ago when I put it on there. Okay. So our criminal subcultures, ooh, my pen is still black. Okay, our criminal subcultures often have their own sets of values as well, right? And things like the way they justify how they do things. So in a lot of criminal subcultures, you'll have things like, denying personal responsibilities for actions as a normal part of the criminal subculture, right? It's not you, it's the system, or it's society, or whatever. Or even that the act that they commit is actually wrong. And this, often, when they steal something, a lot of criminal subcultures or commit violence against another gang, that those people actually had it coming, right? That this is just they were on my turf. They were on our turf. They were on our corner. So what we did wasn't actually wrong. We're just protecting our territory. And denouncing, people who pass judgment on them. It's just that those people are moralistic and judgy, though not usually put in those terms. And especially if, let's say they stole something from you and you're wealthier than they are, that you got what you deserved, right? That actually, their loyalty is to themselves or the gang, and the social rules are actually an impediment to that. Okay. Someone lost an AirPod. I lost one of mine last night while I was sleeping. It fell behind the bed, and I was very sad. I have to crawl under the bed later and get it. For the chart, does it depend on age at all? Like we would all be ritualists at the moment as undergrads. So here's the thing. I don't think you would be ritualists. Because I think at the moment, the fact that you're here means that you're all conformists, right? You're all for the most part, I suggest, seeking some kind of cultural goal, which is probably you want a great job afterwards, or mommy and daddy told you had to come, or you have to pay rent and you don't want to pay rent. So, but you're following some kind of cultural goal of pleasing your parents. I've known a few undergrads like that. But I think you're all kind of conformists, right? Because you're going through the normal means to get to those goals, right? Now, if you're like my one friend in university who showed up at university, but at the time there was, again, 100 years ago when I was an undergrad, in the time of the dinosaurs, there was an arcade on campus, like where you could play video games, and instead of going to class, he just went and played arcade games the entire time. He was, doing the acceptable thing, going to university, but, it was more ritualized for him. He didn't actually want to be here. And, he failed out after a year, unsurprisingly. I think he's doing okay now. I think he's an accountant, which actually, I don't know if that's okay. Accountant sounds like a terrible job to me, but I understand some people like it. No, stop it. Okay. Okay, well, let's go. What's the difference between retreatism and rebellion? Retreatism is like totally giving up, and rebellion is like you're crazy. Right? You're like, it's like retreatism is just like you live in your mom's basement, you have no, you're playing whatever latest Call of Duty game is, you have no job, you have no ambition, you're not doing anything with your life. Rebellion is like you went off and lived in the woods and you're like off the grid, or you and your friends started your own anarchic commune where you all govern together, but you like stick paper instead of a license plate that says like sovereign citizen, right? And so you're like, I don't belong to the state of Canada, I belong to the state of Jeff, right? That would be the difference with rebellion, right? You're making your own rules and you just want to live off the land by the 5 moose you kill a year, which you do not have tags for, I'm assuming. Okay, if someone were to complete an education undergrad, but then start a soccer academy as a career, is that person an innovator? Is starting a soccer academy not a socially acceptable way of making money? I feel like actually that's a super socially acceptable way. So I think you're just then a conformist because you're not, innovating. I know innovator kind of is a funny word here because it sounds like you should be like making a new iPhone or something, but it's not. What is a mystery school? I don't know. What if you're doing this for reasons which wouldn't result in a normal track of life, such as using this course as a guide to how to start a mystery school? Okay, I don't know what that means, but that's fun. Which category would Walter White fall into? Walter White is most definitely an innovator, right? Walter White falls right here because he wants to be rich and powerful, which are social cultural goals. It's just that he's going about it by making meth. Okay. I got 9 minutes left. I can never tell because people start walking out and I'm like, am I out of time? But that's okay. I understand. We're a million miles away and I have to get back to my office afterwards. That's going to take a while. Okay, so some of the kind of criticisms of functionalists, and especially here coming from a conflict theory perspective, conflict theorists will, whoops, I went forward too fast. Conflict theorists will tend to suggest that functionalists often exaggerate the connection between crime and social class. That actually, and here's the typical conflict theory perspective is, professionals and white-collar people actually commit a lot of crimes as well. Those just tend to be crimes that don't get prosecuted. And we'll talk about why conflict theorists think about this probably next time. But yeah, when we look at self-report surveys, we see is generally a weak association between social class or even poverty and committing crimes, because things like, say, drug use is extremely evenly distributed through the population. If you looked at something like, say, purchasing sex, like paying for prostitution, it's actually something that happens mostly in the middle and upper classes. Poor people generally don't have the disposable income to hire prostitutes. So there's a much weaker correlation. Okay, do I have time for conflict theory? Yes, I do. Okay. So our conflict theory explanation. Why are certain things crimes and other things aren't? Well, what are conflict theorists? And again, think of conflict theory always as the lens of like the oppressor versus the oppressed. And especially in kind of classical terms, these are socioeconomic classes, right? So it's going to be the rich versus the kind of workers, right? So what conflict theorists will say is the rich and powerful members of society will say that certain things are criminal and deviant, typically that are done by other social classes, and are things that would challenge the social order where they happen to sit on top, right? So a couple of things, right? They would, property crimes. They would define property crimes as crimes because they own all the property. And stealing that property obviously challenges their primacy in the social order. If we can just take property as we like, then the whole social order based on who owns stuff is going to break down. But for conflict theorists, they will define in much more lenient ways or not at all things that they do that would, harm others. They would not define as crimes. And you can think of all of the sorts of financial shenanigans that, say, the big banks, especially in the US, get up to, right? Giving people bad mortgages and then dividing those mortgages up into collateralized debt obligations and selling those things off to investors as these investment products, and then the whole thing crashes. Everybody loses money except the people who sold the things in the first place, right? That could be seen as criminal, right? A Ponzi scheme or something like that. But because the rich and powerful are the ones who write the laws, they write laws where they don't get punished for anything. They actually get bailed out. So conflict theorists will say that power is commonly used to perpetuate the privilege of the powerful, right? The powerful create systems where they continue to benefit all the time. And basically, they use their power so that we don't label as criminal or deviant, or at least not in the same ways, things that they do, right? So like, for example, street crime and violent crime are punished much more than white-collar crime, right? So you could embezzle $1 million from a company that you work for, and you could expect to probably get a sentence of somewhere around like a couple of years in a minimum or medium security prison, where, if you happen to mug someone, you're likely going to, get a much longer prison sentence. You stole things that were far less of value, but because you're classing that as a violent crime, you are going to spend more time in prison than the guy who embezzled $1 million. Okay. I can do this. I'll try. I'll start on this a little bit. Okay, so control theory. This is another conflict theory. And it comes from a guy named Travis Hershey, and he's trying to explain a kind of basic thing. So you've heard probably the aphorism that crime doesn't pay. Well, actually, the truth is crime pays extremely well, right? Otherwise, there would be no criminals, right? No one would cook meth if, or make fentanyl or whatever if the rewards for doing, or steal cars or whatever, if the reward for doing so wasn't kind of worth it, right? So Hershey is trying to explain then, why doesn't everybody just commit crimes, right? What is it that keeps people from, all being criminals, all stealing stuff, given that we know that actually crime pays extremely well? All right, maybe we can do the first one here. So basically what he says is it all comes down to kind of these 4 levels of social control. That actually, what you risk in committing crimes is a bunch of other things that you value that keep you from committing those crimes. So the first one, right? Social attachment to respected role models. So this could be anyone, like teachers, so deviance in crime. Why would people, young people not commit crimes? Well, they want to be in the good graces of their teachers and their parents, grandparents, other authority figures. Later, people like employers or potential employers. And if you commit crimes or you are deviant, right, you put some of those social attachments at risk, right? You might not be able to create social attachments or keep social attachments to respected role models. You put those at risk, right? If you get like a face tattoo, right? Potentially employers are going to look at you and be like, ooh, that person is not someone I want to hire. They have a face tattoo because there's a stigma. So you don't get a face tattoo. You don't shoplift because, right, you're going to get in trouble with your parents or the police or, maybe not teachers for shoplifting, but you don't get into fights at school because you don't want to get in trouble with teachers. So that social attachment to respected role models keeps you from moving into deviant behavior. All right, I've used every moment I possibly could. Let's leave it there. We'll talk about 2, 3, 4 next time. We'll finish up deviance and crime, and I think we can get into globalization and then finish that the Tuesday after. So, and then exam. It'll be fun. Okay, we'll see you later. All right.